welcome to the Arc of Justice on Brookline Interactive Group TV. I'm Eric Hyatt. My guest today is Raj Dhanda. Raj is a 50-year Brookline resident, the owner of Nina's Lighting in Coolidge Corner, and a local real estate developer. Raj also serves on the Police Reform Committee. He's here today to talk about his experiences as a small business owner, longtime Brookline resident, and supporter of police reform. I'm really excited to hear what Raj has to say on these crucial topics impacting our community. Please welcome Raj Dhanda. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming on the show. If you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself. I know that your name is Raj Dhanda, and you're an immigrant from India, and I would love to know how you first came to Brookline.
Sure. As I said, Raj Dhanda. I've lived in Cottage Farm district for about 50 years. But to your point about how I ended up in Brookline, I think it's an interesting way that happened. The event was Super Bowl Sunday of 1971. And Nina and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in South Weymouth. But my TV was broken and I wanted to see the game. So I called up my boss who lived on High Street in Brookline. And he said, come on over, we'll watch the game together. So while I was waiting for a couple hours, I had a couple hours to kill, I called a broker who met me at what used to be Beacon 1200 Motel, now Holiday Inn. And she met me there and she took me to the house we eventually ended up buying. Obviously, there was much else happened, but that's how we really ended up in Brookline. And it has been for most part, a very wonderful journey and time that we've lived in Brookline.
I would love to. You said you've been here for 50 years in the town of Brookline. That's quite a long journey. I'd love to hear some of your sort of high points about that journey.
Sure. So the 70s and 80s, our children were young, going to the schools, and we were, as you might imagine, any typical suburban family, enjoyed all the happenings around town. We used to actually play a lot of tennis, and we would spend extensive amount of time at all the tennis courts that Brookline had to offer. And of course, our children both started in the Brookline school system. Rachna, who still lives in Brookline, she went to the high school and then on to Harvard. And our son, after Lawrence School, he moved on to Roxbury Latin and then on to college. And I would call the 70s and 80s just enjoyable, interesting times. There were not what I would call any major events or controversies in Brookline. The Coolidge Corner area was mostly the commercial entities. There were mostly local merchants and local restaurant owners. And that was sort of the beauty of it. The big brands had not yet shown up. So that's, it was, again, expensive, but not as expensive as it's gotten now. All around, we just had wonderful time as living in a suburban town. And of course, being so close to Boston was always a great feeling. You could just get in the car in 10 minutes, you were in the very downtown. So that's how I would describe in the 70s and 80s. And in the late 80s, I opened Nina's Lighting showroom at part of which is now occupied by Trader Joe's, that space there. We had tremendous business for many years, and also as I got a little later into the 80s, I started getting into real estate, and actually a little later on, I did some development projects. So as I look back into the 90s, things changed. 1995, the rent control in Boston and Brookline and Cambridge was removed, and big brands started to show up at Coolidge Corner, and development projects started to happen. For example, 1160 Beacon and the one next to Emery Park. Those were the first, I think, two big projects. I myself undertook the project across from Stop and Shop. I built that building and learned a lot about how the process in Brookline worked.
Well, you have a very interesting perspective as both a small business owner in Brookline and also as somebody trying to actually construct new buildings and including housing. How did that change? You were mentioning around 1995 there was a change in law. Not all of our viewers are that familiar, so maybe you can explain what happened around 1995 that caused Coolidge Corner area.
Yes, so there was rent control in Boston, Brookline, and Cambridge up to 1995. And then a state referendum, it was overturned. And what that did was it gave some good, positive, optimistic feeling to the developers in the general area that Brookline now was open to doing new projects. Prior to that, frankly, the average age in Brookline, I know that because I worked at Stop and Shop, and I would study the demographics when I would recommend different sites like the one on Harvard Street. The average age up to that point was, I think, 38, median age, sorry. And that was very high. That was probably the highest in the local suburbs around Boston. And that meant that there was only certain kind of economic things happened. But once the rent control was removed and new development started to take place, Brookline became the first stop, so to speak, of people, young professionals in Boston. When they thought of moving out of Boston, Brookline was, and still is, to a very large degree, the first stop, if you will, heading out of Boston. And as I said earlier, the Coolidge Corner area suddenly started to get national brands as tenants. And there was some not good feeling about a lot of people that the local shops were being pushed out. But all around, I feel it stayed very much a town where you could say most of the things you needed in a day-to-day life, you could get done at Coolidge Corner, maybe some big things you needed to. And that was part of the attraction and charm of Brookline.
It's funny for me to hear that because I grew up in Brookline. I left and then I moved back here in 2008. And the Brookline that I found, especially around Coolidge Corner, it it seems that there's like almost a crash happening in Coolidge Corner. It seems like it is almost contracting somehow. I know that you have some like a really long history, more than almost anyone, with the cycle of development in Coolidge Corner. Do you have any sort of concerns about what you're seeing there right now?
Well, as I see Coolidge Corner, and this with having gotten two projects approved, one next to Trader Joe's, a very large project, housing and a mixed-use project, and one in Chestnut Hill. I think I want to say that the permitting process in Brookline remains and is extremely difficult. And Coolidge Corner particularly, and even the Route 9 part of it, if you look at the current zoning regulations, it's very hard, very expensive to do a project. And I think what needs to happen is some major changes to zoning in the nature of FAR, which is floor area ratio, which determines the size of building you can build on a piece of land. That needs to change dramatically. Otherwise, and staying on that subject, and there's a good bit of conversation going on in the planning department, and some other warrant articles have been put out there for it, but it needs to pick up speed, because if we don't, in my opinion, Coolidge Corner will deteriorate and unable to sustain the economic activity that has been the hallmark of Brookline. As you and everybody else knows, the e-commerce giants have done a number on the small businesses, and I don't think that many of those businesses are coming back. I think the only kind of businesses that can sustain themselves are businesses which have either a very special product or very special service or a combination of both. Because the generic retail is really part of history. And for Coolidge Corner to remain vibrant, we need to be able to have housing development. For example, the buildings at 420 Harvard Street and 455, those are, as I'm sure you know, part of the 40B process, but there are no more projects that can be done under 40B. So this moment, unless something changes significantly, there won't be any developments. And I've been discussing with the planning department that potentially Harvard Street could become a little bit of Newberry Street, where you have housing on the upper levels and commercial activity on the street level. So I think that's where it needs to go to have a viable future in terms of Coolidge Corner, or for that matter, Washington Square or any of the other commercial nodes in Brookline.
Before we move on to the next topic, there was one thing I wanted, because I'm kind of a nerd. I know there's something called a triple net lease, and I was hoping you could just explain what that is to people who might not know what those are.
Sure. So vast number of commercial, by that I mean leases that the restaurants or retail shops sign, they are triple net. What that means is that there is a base rent that the landlord receives. In addition, the tenant pays real estate tax and any common area charges, whether it's insurance, whether it's maintenance, whether it's cleaning, any of those things. Now, that's true for commercial tenants. And that means that whatever tax changes happen at the town level, meaning if the tax goes up, essentially the rent goes up. All that the landlord does is pass that increase to the tenant. So when people think or talk about the commercial landlords being able to afford to pay a lot of real estate tax, frankly, that's very misunderstood, because all that the landlords are doing is passing it on to the tenant. So it's really the tenant who's paying it, not the landlord.
Thank you. You're the first person to perfectly clarify that. I guess maybe because you've been on both sides of these transactions as a small business owner and also as a landlord, I think you're uniquely qualified to understand these things. So thank you.
Yeah.
I know that you have been volunteering to serve on the police reform committee in the town, and have been an active member of that fairly recently formed committee. So I would just love to get some background in how you got involved in police reform, and just talk a little bit about policing in Brookline based on your 50 years of experience here.
Sure. So, as you said, recently the town established two committees related to the police in Brookline, and I joined the committee for police reform. Now, my motivation to join this, apart from wanting to do the right things for the community in terms of how people of color are treated, and also, as many of us know, over the decades, Brookline did not have a good reputation in terms of how people of color were treated, whether it's at a traffic stop or whether it's any other kind of small or not so small events. But I personally had experienced three situations which really changed my whole perspective of Brookline. Brookline is and continues to be a beautiful town just west of Boston, but it has really troubled me as an immigrant and a person of color how police have handled my own three events, and I'm happy to go over them quickly. So I was very interested in seeing what I could do by joining the police reform committee. It was the first time, frankly, I thought there had been any inclination on the part of the town to even talk about, and probably resulted from number of high-profile national events that have happened. So if you would like, I would quickly go over the events and then talk more about the police reform committee.
Thank you. Yes, I attended the subcommittee last week of the Police Reform Committee. I attended the Accountability Subcommittee, and I heard you pretty courageously give some testimony. So yeah, any of that you would feel comfortable sharing with Brookline viewers, I would love to hear those stories, even if they're a little bit hard to tell.
Sure. So the first event that happened was in 1993, I believe, September 93. And in those days, I had a store, a lighting showroom, where part of the building where Trader Joe's is. And I used to, at lunchtime, I would ask my employees what they wanted for lunch. And I would go out, buy them lunch, and bring it to the store. This one afternoon, I did the same thing. And as I'm returning, I was at the intersection of Beacon and Harvard on the northwest corner where Brookline Bank is. And as I was waiting for the pedestrian light to turn, a car came 3/4 into the walkway and stopped there. And when my light, the pedestrian light changed, I walked around the car and spotted a police officer in the middle of the Beacon Street. I walked up to him and I said, "Officer, do you see that?" Pointing to the situation where car was in the pedestrian walkway. And can you do something about it? It's a dangerous condition. And he said to me, he looked at me and he said, "I'm here as a detail for the gas company." To which I said, "But the gas person is in the manhole and there's not much you can do about him. This is a dangerous condition and you can do something about it." And he looked at me, his kind of face a little flush, and he said, "You should go back to where you came from." Totally stunned I was. So I said to him, I said, "Officer, can I have your badge number?" He was wearing a windbreaker and the badge was covered. So he responded by saying, "I want your identification." To which I said, "I don't have to give you any identification, officer. I'm a citizen." Anyways, I followed up with a request for a complaint against the officer, which was scheduled, And so one day I went to the police department for the hearing, and I obviously had no experience or idea what the protocol was. So as we sat down and the officer was going to talk to me, I said, "Can I be in the? Can I ask questions when you interview the police officer?" Which he said he was going to, and he said, "No. Can I just sit in the room and listen?" He said, "No." So I said, "What is the purpose of the hearing?" And he said to me, "Mr. Dhanda, let me be honest with you. The only thing that will happen is there will be a note in his personnel file which will say that there was a complaint filed." I was disappointed to hear that because I felt that if we were just going through some protocol which wasn't going to end up in anything. The next event that really troubled me was, I think it was 95, Christmas Eve 1995. I used to own apartment buildings near Washington and Comm Ave in Brighton. So this one night, my resident super called me and said the heat had turned off. To which I said, "Well, call the heating company. We have a contract. They'll come and take care of it." 2 minutes later, I called him back and I said, "You know what? I know what to do. It's a control that needs some adjustment. So I'll come over." I threw sweatpants and hooded sweatshirt on and jumped into my car, which was a red Jaguar. admittedly an expensive car, and made my way to the point where Babcock meets Harvard Street. And as I was waiting, I saw a police car on Harvard Street headed north, number 2 in the line. And instinctively, I touched my pockets and I said, oh, shucks, I forgot to bring my wallet. So I said to myself, no worry, just make sure you're absolutely complying with all traffic rules. So my light turned green, I turned right, and the police car jumped out of its formation and came right behind me, literally hugging my car. He did not put blue lights on. He just kept staying very tight on me. And I said, okay, I'll only drive less than 20 miles speed. And so this went on up to Fuller Street, where I turned left, and he turned left. Same thing continued. I got up to Winchester, turned right, and he turned right. Same thing continued. And he did not pull me over because I didn't give him any reason to. But he was seriously harassing me. And I continued to the apartment building, did my thing, then went to the police station. And I went to the person at the counter and I said, officer, this is what happened. I need you to ask that officer to come in. I want to ask why he was harassing me. And he said, well, he was probably following you. He went back into the office, talked to somebody, and said, well, that's what was happening. I said, no, officer, that was not following me or observing me. He actually said he was observing me. And the officer went back in the room and came back, and he said, now we know why he was following you. And I said, tell me. He said, because 5 of your 6 digits on the license plate match a red Jaguar, same model, that was stolen. Now, I have done graduate studies in probability and statistics, so I leaned over to him and I said, officer, tell me again, just so I know. And I said to him, I think you got a better chance of winning the lottery.
Yeah.
So I filed a complaint, and the hearing officer came to see me at Nina's, and we talked about this event, and it was the same officer from before. And he said, Mr. Dhanda, the truth of the matter is he was following you because you're a dark-skinned person wearing a hooded sweatshirt, driving an expensive car late at night. I said to him, I said, you know, at least I can say that you're being truthful.
That does sound like the truth. Racial profiling, that does sound at least like the truth.
Yes, absolutely. And the last event, which I think was the most grievous, happened in 2015. One mid-morning, I drove up to 1299, the parking lot in the back, which I own. I own 1299 building and the lot. And I was, when I arrived there was a police officer and a orange cone blocking the entrance. And I put my window down. I said to the officer, I own this place. I need to come in. He said, you can't. I said, officer, I own this place. What? And I did not give any authority for anyone to block the entrance, do any work. Nothing, because at that point I noticed there was some Eversource or Verizon, I think Verizon trucks in the parking lot. I said, please remove the cone. And he said, you need to move, otherwise I'm going to give you a parking ticket. I said, officer, come on, or words to that effect. So then I called the police station. I said, please send a supervisor. A few minutes later, another police officer, not a supervisor, came, and the two of them talked. And the second officer said, I'd have to move. I said, I don't understand what you can't understand about this whole thing. Now, while this conversation is going on, the first officer happened to walk around to the passenger side of my car, and the second officer was standing near the left rear fender. And so the officer first officer, he said, I'm going to give you a ticket for not having your inspection sticker current. And he demanded that I give him my driver's license and my registration. And I'm beside myself. I said, what is going on? So I didn't immediately give those to him, but I did eventually. And as I was doing all this, I stood outside, got out of the car, and the second officer said to me, get back in. And as he's saying, he put his hand on his revolver and unbuttoned or unclipped the holster. And I thought I was within 2 seconds of being shot. So I sat back, gave him the things, and filed a complaint. And the supervisor came, and eventually we had a hearing, which I think was very unsatisfactory. And finally, I asked for a hearing with the select board, which has never been scheduled. Another small side part of this event was about a half hour before I came, 45 minutes before I came, one of my employees, who is a white woman, wonderful person, her husband came to drop her off. And police officer had absolutely no issue with allowing her to come in, although in a later interview with the police department, she did say that he seemed to have a bit of an attitude. So these are sort of quick summaries of 3 events that have formed my opinion of the police department. So when the opportunity to join the police reform committee came, I immediately applied. And so this committee is 11 voting members and a handful of non-voting members. The committee has been meeting pretty much every 2 weeks for a few months now. And at this moment, I can say I'm disillusioned, disappointed, and not happy at all for how the committee is moving or not moving forward. My first issue is with the person who is head of the committee, Bernard Green. He's a select board chair at this point. And so Bernard Green was endorsed by the police department in his election. I don't know if he also received money, but he was endorsed. So my first question or comment is, how can a person who was endorsed by the police department be conducting a a reform on the police department. And interestingly, at a number of weeks back, when I raised the question of issues with the police department, he responded to me saying that you cannot assume, he said there cannot be a presumption that there is any issue with the police department. Really, I say, Bernard, what planet do you live on? I mean, I could not believe, and everything that has been happening in the committee. I mean, we are doing things like listening to somebody in HR department for 45 minutes. I'm not really sure what that has to do with the reforms of the police department. I don't think we are talking about their personnel protocol or pay raises, which is a whole separate question. But we also listened at length to two police officers who are at the school, high school, and I'm sure they're doing a wonderful job, don't get me wrong. But that again has nothing to do, as I see, with the police reform.
That's very clear.
Contrast to that, as a part of the subcommittee that I'm a part of in the same effort, I personally interviewed a woman who used to live apparently in the Brookline Housing Authority unit somewhere. And she had some incident and she spoke to me for 25 minutes, very courageous woman, because the police department discouraged her from filing a report. And she shared her video that she took of the conversations she had with the desk officer when she wanted to file a report. And the officer is telling her, well, you can download the form and put in a report. And he had the body language of, why are you wasting my time? When I asked Bernard to allow this woman to testify, he said, we don't have time for that. I said, you don't have time to hear from a victim, and you have time for all these folks. And he also had wanted us to view some tapes of some unrelated matters, as I could see. So all around, I think what I want to say is this. The reform effort is, I hope I'm totally wrong, but what it's going to end up being is some nice sounding report that will say some stuff that will have really no impact on where the citizen and the police meet, and the whole aspect of serving the citizen, which I think is the number one priority of the police department. I don't think any of that is getting addressed. And that is really very disturbing, and it should be disturbing to anybody. I think all we are doing is going through some exercise, and I hope I'm wrong, because naturally I love Brookline. I've lived here 50 years. I believe very strongly in changes being made so that people of color are treated same as everybody else. I mean, think about it this way. There is as we speak, 20% of population, or maybe even a little higher, of people of color, Asian Americans, who really make Brookline what it is.
Yep.
Very wonderful, and we have hundreds of people we know. So that's really very troubling to me.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you for your courage in stating it so clearly. Because we're sort of limited on time today, I want to make sure that I get the chance to ask you one final question, which is Brookline a wonderful place to live?
Yes, it's a wonderful place to live. As I said, there's beautiful, interesting, diverse population. Naturally, Brookline has some geographic advantages. And the fact that I've lived here 50 years and I don't intend to move it except once speaks to it. There are challenges, and I think they need to be addressed. But yes, Brookline is a very viable and wonderful place to live. We enjoy living in Brookline.